Hi, my name is Fafs Reederer. I'm a grad student in transportation engineering at the University of Colorado, Denver. And today I'm going to present to you a project I did in GIS about Tucson's traffic and injuries and deaths in Tucson. Let's get started. So in transportation engineering and city planning, there's a movement called Vision Zero. And the idea behind this movement is that traffic fatalities and serious injuries are preventable. All crashes aren't preventable. Probably sometimes a crash is going to happen because humans make mistakes. But if we design our systems so that those mistakes are small, or the crashes that happen when people make mistakes are small and that people aren't killed or seriously injured, then we'll have a much better network. So the goal of Vision Zero is to eliminate severe injuries and fatalities. And Vision Zero has come to the United States recently in the last 5 or 6 years. It's been adopted in Denver, where I'm going to school, and it's not yet been adopted in Tucson, although Tucson recently adopted a complete streets initiative, which is in the direction of moving in the direction of Vision Zero. And another principle of Vision Zero is that it's data driven, that we look at data to decide how to improve the street network, the transportation network. And one of the tools that we use is the high injury network. So we're going to take a look today at Tucson, Arizona. This is a beautiful picture of that beautiful city. When we look at the commute share in Tucson, only 2% of people who commute to work commute by walking. 76% commute via their car, via a personal car, and then about 2% also bike. But if we look over at traffic deaths, we see that you can't see it because I'm covering the screen, but 33% of the traffic deaths in Tucson are pedestrians. So that's a big mismatch, and pedestrians are the most vulnerable road users in Tucson for sure. Just about a little over a month ago, Daniel Benavidez, who was 49 years old, was injured and killed. Later, he died while attempting to cross Pima Street at about 10 p.m. And so Pima Street is an example of a high-speed arterial in Tucson. And as we'll see, those streets are very common in Tucson. In 2018, there were 28 pedestrian fatalities. They've been on the rise for the last 4 years or so. When we look at peer cities for Tucson, we're looking at other southwestern cities and mid-sized cities. Tucson has around 1 million people in its metro area. We can see that in terms of the pedestrian danger index, which is the likelihood that a pedestrian is injured on the road, and normalized for population and population size, and also for the walk share. We see that Tucson is somewhere in the middle of this group of peer cities. So this is a street map of Tucson. These are the major roads. These are the arterials. Let's see if I can point out Pima Road for you. Well, it's not important, but as you can see, there's a highway that runs here, sort of diagonally through the city, and also down here. But most of the city is covered by this grid of arterial roads. So this is the data set that I'm going to use in this project. And this data set is provided by the city of Tucson, and it's all crashes from 2012 to 2018. And the data set actually begins in July 2012, on July 31st. So these are all crashes, but that's not that useful for the high injury network. What we're most interested in are the crashes that require immediate medical attention, or the crashes that produce a fatality. So what I took this data set and I exported it to Excel and exported the attribute table. And that allowed me to group all of the streets, all the crashes by street name, and then collect them with pivot table. And I created this chart that I really like here, this graph. And on this graph, you can see that in this region here, there are some streets that have an enormous number of crashes, and of course, many streets that have very few crashes. So the highest number of crashes in that 5-year period was on Broadway Boulevard. So let's take a look. Let's zoom in on this region of the chart, and we can see that the chart now goes from Broadway, and I'm covering it, but over to Fort Lowell Boulevard, or Fort Lowell Road. I'll hop back to this other chart. You can see that that's just these first 3 roads here. So we're looking at a region in this area. If we count up all the crashes in Tucson in that period and add them up and sum them, they are accounted for in just these top 24 streets, 24 roads. So this is going to compose Tucson's high injury network. I should say, if we take 50% of the crashes that produced serious injuries or fatalities. And like I said, this is all those streets are in just this region of this larger chart. So we can take this list of streets that we developed in Excel and come back over to GIS and map them on the Tucson road network. And as you can see here, these are the 24 streets that produced the highest number of crashes that injured or killed people. Excuse me. This is pretty much the arterial network in Tucson. And if we had a little larger threshold, I'm sure we would see streets like this and this pop up, but we cut it off at 50%, which is an arbitrary number. And as you could see from this chart, there's not an excellent cutoff, but we're gonna use the 50% number. So let's take a look. This is Denver's high injury network map. And a difference that I see between Denver and the map that I just produced in GIS is that this map is cut off in certain regions. So I want to use GIS to similarly limit Tucson's high injury network map, because we're only interested in the areas of those streets that have a lot of crashes. So let's take a look at our cartographic model. And what we can do in GIS is take our original data points and create new layers. This layer here is based on crashes where people were given immediate medical attention and transferred to a hospital. This layer here is created by crashes that were fatal. So we're going to go ahead and merge those layers and then use a kernel density tool in order to create so the merged layers will first go ahead and look like this. So this is severe injuries and fatal crashes. And then we're going to use a kernel density tool to create a map that looks like this. So this is kernel density of serious injury and fatality crashes in Tucson. As you can see, there are some hot spots here around downtown. This is around the streets Grant and Alvernon. Also a pretty dense area for these kind of crashes. So now we can take the 24 streets that are the most dangerous in Tucson, and we can clip these 24 streets based on the layer that we created. That's here. So you can see in this picture that these 24 streets, we're not as interested in these areas out here. The high injury network is just where the kernel density map shows us where the density is. And this is the map we've produced. It's Tucson's high injury network. And here's a formal map. As you can see, 50% of severe injury crashes and fatality crashes occur on just 3% of Tucson's roads. So how can you use a high injury network map? New York City used their high injury network map and their Vision Zero, has found that they were able to reduce crashes that kill people by 1/3, and it was mainly due to lowering speeds. So in Tucson, when we look at our high injury network, all of these are high-speed arterial roads, and what Tucson can do if it wants to cut down on crashes is to lower speeds on these arterials. If we look to an example, there's a study recently in Boston where the citywide default speed limit was lowered from 30 to 25 miles per hour. And a study found that just doing this change, even on streets that were not signed, where they didn't have this kind of sign, drivers are 30% less likely to be going 35 miles per hour. And what we know based on data is that speed is a really serious cause of serious injury and death. And if we can lower speeds, we will have much better outcomes. Let's talk about some of the concerns and challenges that we had, or that I had in this project. First of all, the road layer was artificially limited. So let's take a look at this map here. As you can see, the roads layer that I was able to find doesn't extend all the way to the boundaries of the city of Tucson. It has an artificial boundary here. So my 3% figure is based on a calculation that looked at the shape length of roads in general and then measured it in ratio to the shape length of the high injury network. So it's possible that that 3% is high, that Tucson could have 50% of its crashes happening on an even smaller percentage of its roads. Another concern that I had is around spatial analysis. So I used a kernel density function or tool in order to create the high injury network map. But in terms of using kriging or hotspot analysis, two other tools, I can't really justify the kernel density tool versus these other ones. And I just don't understand the difference between them well enough to say. And it's possible that another tool would be of better use. Another thing that I'm thinking about in this project is that what we're doing is spatial analysis on the raster. So we're taking, if we look at this map here, we're taking all the points that were created and doing a kernel density map, and that gives us this raster. And what this raster tells us, or what it assumes, is that locations near points that we know are similar, and locations far from data that we have are more dissimilar. And so we create this kind of map. But there's two issues with that. I don't know that that assumption is necessarily true in the case of crashes. I don't know that because there's an intersection, for instance, that has a high injury rate or a high accident rate, that a space, say 100 feet or 50 feet from that intersection, also has a high rate. I think that assumption is questionable. And then further, what we're looking at when we look at these crashes is we see that they're not equally distributed around the plane, but that they occur on this grid. And so I'm not sure if the spatial analysis tool that we're using can account for this grid or is designed for the grid. So if we look at this, we don't really see, we see densities in the center of these major streets that might not be accurate. And so there might be a way to fine-tune that analysis to reflect the gridded nature of the streets. So let's see. In terms of interpolation theory, one of the assumptions is that point values that are closer together tend to be similar. And so I'm not sure that that's true for this kind of analysis of crashes. In terms of future research, I'd love to compare my high injury network with one from the ArcGIS package. So ArcGIS creates an analysis tool that you can use to build a high injury network. That wasn't available in the version that I have at school, but I would love to in the future compare my results with one that is produced via the official package. And in terms of another future avenue of research, we could fine-tune the high injury network and look at one that especially considers where pedestrians are in most danger. That concludes this portion of my project. Thanks for tuning in, and come visit Tucson.